The Archimedes broke apart at 3:17 station time. I know the hour because I had just checked my watch, a habit from my father, who believed that a man who didn't know the time was a man who wasn't paying attention. I was paying attention, for all the good it did me. I'd been running a diagnostic on the port thruster manifold in the lower maintenance corridor when the first impact came through. Not an alarm, not a klaxon, the alarms came later. What arrived first was a sound, a low resonant groan, that moved through the hull the way thunder moves through the bones of a house in the middle of the night, felt before it's heard. Then a second sound, sharper, almost metallic and almost musical at once, which I understood later to be the structural ribs of the Archimedes, folding at frame 14. Between those two sounds, there was exactly enough time for a person to understand that something was very wrong and not enough time to do anything about it. Grabbed Rook's lead. I clipped it to his harness. I pulled the emergency hatch. Those 3 actions took me approximately 4 seconds, and I did them in the right order. And the reason I did them in the right order rather than in the wrong order or no order at all is that I had thought about this situation before. Not obsessively, but I had thought about it. In my 9 years working ship maintenance across outer system freight haulers, I had run the emergency scenarios in my head. Enough times that when the scenario arrived in the real world, my hands already knew what to do. The mind catches up to the hands afterward. I mention this because it is the only intelligent thing I did in the first minute of the crisis, and I want to be accurate about what belongs to training and what belongs to luck. It's a German Shepherd, 9 years old. He came to me from the work animal registry on Callaway Station, where I'd spent 4 years running maintenance on the freight haulers that cycled through that part of the outer belt. He was 3 when I signed the papers. Trained, already past the anxiety phase that makes young dogs difficult in enclosed spaces and loud environments. Already the kind of animal who looked at you before he moved, who assessed before he committed. Coat is the standard black and tan of the breed, but he has a white patch over his left eye that gives him a permanently questioning look. People on Callaway liked that expression. Tolerated people on Callaway with the professionalism of a contractor who has learned that the client relationship is part of the job. He had been working ships with me for 6 years. He knew emergency corridors. He knew the difference between a pressure alarm and a hull breach alarm by the pitch. He knew, in whatever way dogs know things that they have no language for, when a situation had moved from routine to serious. He was already on his feet when I reached for his lead. The escape pod bay had 3 pods racked against the port side bulkhead. 2 of them were gone. I could see the empty cradles, the blown seals still smoking slightly at the edges, which meant they'd been fired in the first seconds of the breach, either by crew who'd been closer to the bay when it happened, or by the automated evac sequence that triggers at critical hull integrity loss. I didn't have time to determine which. The 3rd pod was there. The hatch was accessible. I got Rook inside, pulled myself in after him, sealed the hatch, and hit the manual launch sequence, because I didn't know if the automated sequence was still functioning, and I wasn't interested in finding out. Pod fired. I had gotten Rook into the harness mount in the 2 seconds between sealing the hatch and the launch sequence completing, which was the right call, because the launch force pressed us both back hard. I had not gotten myself properly into the human harness, and I spent the first 40 seconds of the drop trajectory with my left shoulder working free of the restraint and my body torquing against it in a way that cracked 2 ribs against the interior strut. I noted the pain, categorized it as manageable, and held the harness with my hands for the remainder of the descent. Was calm throughout. He had been in pressure-tested escape launch simulations twice a year on Callaway, which was the station's safety requirement. And he had learned that the launch itself, loud, violent, brief, was followed by a long, quiet descent that was boring rather than dangerous. He braced his legs and held his position, and looked at me with an expression that was either inquiry or reassurance, and I've never been certain which. The planet came up fast. Registry designation TL9 Bravo Ice World. Thin atmosphere. Breathable in a pressurized suit for approximately 6 hours before the CO2 scrubbers on a standard issue survival suit began to fail. Surface temperature at the equatorial band, where the pod's ballistic trajectory dropped us, was somewhere around minus 47 degrees standard. The planet had no name in our charts beyond the designation, which is the way of things in the outer systems. Places get numbers before they get names, and some of them never make it past the numbers, because there's nothing there that anyone needs to name. TL9 Bravo had been surveyed once, 11 years before the Archimedes made its run through the system, and the survey report had generated a notation that no one had read carefully since. I didn't know about the notation yet. The pod hit the surface and the impact absorbers took most of it, and the locator beacon lit automatically, and the heater cycled up. And Rook and I sat on the pod floor and breathed cycled air and listened to the wind that had immediately found the pod and was testing it. It was not a gentle wind. It was the kind of wind that sounds like it has a purpose but has no purpose, like a thing that doesn't have a shape but is trying to find one. It came in from the northwest at irregular intervals, and the pod's exterior skin registered the temperature on the instrument panel. 49 below, 46 below, 49 again. The panel also showed atmospheric particulate count, which was elevated in a way that could mean storm, or it could mean something else. And since I didn't know what something else would mean on this particular planet, I filed it as data without interpretation and watched it lay down beside me. He pressed against my left side, which was the side with the cracked ribs, and I shifted my weight so that the contact was on my right instead, and he adjusted without complaint. We had been in bad situations before. Not as bad as this, but bad enough that we had developed this particular grammar, this physical vocabulary of adjustment and acknowledgement. Shh, he was warm. In a cold pod on a frozen planet in the outer system, a large dog who presses his warmth against you is not a small thing. 40 minutes after landing, the rescue frequency opened. Shh. The voice that came through was clipped and professional, slightly distorted by the distance between us and wherever the Sojourner was currently running. They gave me a call sign to confirm identity. I gave it, and a confirmation number for the pod's registry. They confirmed they had my locator. They told me the Sojourner was the nearest available response ship, currently 9 hours and some minutes out. They ran through the pod's survival rating, 18 hours, standard load, and confirmed that the margin was comfortable. They asked about injuries. I told them 2 cracked ribs, no lacerations, suit integrity confirmed. They noted it. Then the voice changed. Not dramatically. Not enough that I could have told you afterward that I'd heard the change clearly, but there was a shift in cadence. A fraction more deliberate, the same way a pilot's voice shifts slights when they're switching from routine communication to something that requires exact comprehension. Mr. Marsh, I need to give you 3 instructions, and I need confirmation understanding on each one. Go ahead, I said. Do not leave the pod. Copy. Do not activate any additional broadcast equipment. Your beacon is already lit. Do not add to the signal profile. Copy. Do not move from your current coordinates, under any circumstances. The Sojourner will have you in 8 hours and 40 minutes. Do you copy all 3? Copy all 3, I said. Then, what am I not moving for? There was a pause. Transmission lag. I know transmission lag, and this was a half-second too long and too even to be lag. It was someone on the other end of the line deciding how much to say. TL9 Bravo has a flagged notation in the survey registry, the voice said. The notation is unresolved, and we don't have full data from it. What we have is enough for the flag. Stay in the pod. Maintain your current signal profile, and the Sojourner will reach you in 8 hours and 40 minutes. You have the margin. Understood? Understood, I said. The frequency closed. I sat with the 3 instructions for a while. I checked the pod's external sensors. Wind, temperature, particulate count was still elevated, and still rising in those slow, irregular increments that didn't match a steady storm pattern. Storm's particulate count rises and falls with the gusts. This rose in longer, slower intervals. The rises were separated by gaps that were too even to be weather. I watched it for 20 minutes, couldn't make it into weather. It aside, and ate half a ration bar, and drank some water, and lay down on my side with Rook against my back, and my cracked ribs complaining against the pod floor. I did not sleep. I don't think I could have slept. But I went somewhere else for a while. That specific zone of exhausted alertness where the body is recovering and the mind is running very slowly over the same small set of facts in a loop. The Archimedes was gone. 3 crew members had not made it to the pod bay. I had made it. Rook had made it. The Sojourner was 8 hours out. There was a flag on this planet that nobody had data for. In that somewhere else zone, I thought about the crew. There were 11 of us on the Archimedes. I ran through the roster in my head, the way you run through a parts inventory. Systematically, because it's the only way to know what's missing. The Captain Voss had been on the bridge when Frame 14 went. The 2 bridge officers with him, the engineer Radek, who had been in the lower section of the engine compartment, closer to the breach than I was. 3 others, whose watch rotation I didn't know precisely enough to place them. That was 7 people I couldn't account for. I thought about Radek. He'd been the one to loan me the diagnostic reader I'd been using on the manifold when it happened. And I'd thought, at the time, that I should get it back to him before the shift ended. I would not be getting it back to him. Things like that. The small, unfinished, completely ordinary handoffs of working life have a way of becoming the things you think about in the dark afterward, because they matter, because they are specific. You think about the specific things because the large things are too large. I watched the particulate count climb on the instrument panel. Rook shifted beside me in the dark. He was awake. I could tell by the quality of his breathing, which is different when he's awake even when he's still. He put his muzzle on my knee for a moment, not seeking attention, just contact, acknowledging that we were both awake in the dark, on a planet neither of us had signed up for. I put my hand on his head for a moment, and he accepted it, and then lifted his muzzle and went back to watching the pod with the composed attention of a dog who is monitoring his environment professionally. That composure is not nothing. I want to be clear about that. A dog of 9 years who has spent 6 of those years on working freight ships has encountered a great many things that human beings in that environment also encounter. Pressure alarms, mechanical failures, sudden jolts of deceleration. The specific acoustic chaos of a ship under stress. Had been in bad situations before. He knew what a bad situation sounded and smelled and felt like, and his response to bad situations was not panic. It was increased attention. He got quieter and more precise. He focused. In the pod on TL9 Bravo, in the dark with the wind testing the hull and the particulate count climbing in its slow, irregular rhythm, he was focused. I took some comfort in that. If there had been something immediately threatening, something that required alarm, he would have told me. He would not have put his muzzle on my knee. He would have been on his feet. His composure was data. It said, the situation is serious, but it is not yet critical. Wait and watch. So I waited and watched. At 0511 station time, the distress signal came in. It hit the emergency band, short range, low power, the specific frequency and packet structure of a survival suit's emergency transmitter operating in manual mode. Not automated. A suit's emergency transmitter fires automatically if the suit detects life sign cessation, which is a feature I have always found grimly logical. Manual activation means the person wearing the suit was alive and conscious and deliberately chose to press the button. The signal was coming from approximately 230 meters northeast of my position. I sat with that number, 230 meters. On a clear day on flat ground, I could walk that in 3 minutes. On a fractured ice surface in a blizzard in -47, I didn't know what it was. But someone out there had pressed the button. Someone from the Archimedes, almost certainly. The signal format was consistent with our ship's suit registry. Someone was alive out there and had made the decision to tell me so. I thought about what that decision cost them. You don't press the emergency transmitter unless you need to, and you don't need to unless you can't self-rescue. The signal was telling me that someone was alive, but could not to a pod, could not move, most likely, could not make it on their own. They had pressed the button because pressing the button was all they had left. And they had done it deliberately, in the dark, in the cold, on a planet with a flag on it that nobody had data for. That's a specific kind of person. The kind who runs out of options before they run out of trying. I watched the clock for 6 minutes. I know it was 6 because I was watching it. I went over the math several times, and it came out the same each time. The rescue protocol existed to protect the person following it, me. It was based on the reasonable assumption that one confirmed survivor, in a pod with supplies and a beacon, and a confirmed rescue window was more reliable than an unconfirmed outcome that required moving through unknown conditions toward an unknown situation. The math of that is sound. It protects one person with high reliability. The suit transmitter, 230 meters northeast, was a different person. I looked at Rook. He was already standing. I want to be precise about this because the debrief analysts asked me several times to reconstruct the sequence, and I gave them the same answer each time. He was lying when the distress signal came in. He was standing by the time I had decided to go. He was not standing between those two events. He went from lying to standing in the sim motion without the intermediate settling and adjusting that a resting dog goes through when it rises normally. He had come up, the way a dog comes up when the thing it's been waiting for has finally happened. Don't know what he heard or sensed through the pod's insulation that told him I had made a decision. Working dogs develop a sensitivity to human decision-making that is almost impossible to explain to someone who hasn't spent years alongside one. He wasn't reading the sensor panel. He was reading me, and whatever he read told him that we were getting up, and he was ready before I was. I suited up deliberately. The suit's heater took 40 seconds to reach operational temperature, and I let it take those 40 seconds, because rushing gear checks in a survival situation is how people who should have survived don't. I checked the oxygen levels. I checked the wrist unit. It was showing the distress signal direction and strength clearly. Checked the gloves, both seals. Pulled the helmet and locked it. Heard the pressure equalization click. Felt the temperature differential vanish. Then I clipped Rook's harness, lead to the short tether ring on my suit's hip attachment. He looked at the tether, and then at me. He knew what it was for. He had been on a short tether in reduced visibility situations before, and he understood the logic. In a whiteout, a dog can navigate by senses a human doesn't have, but the human needs to stay in physical contact to follow the navigation. Tether was not a restraint, it was a communication line. He accepted it. I cracked the pod hatch. The cold through the gap before the hatch was a centimeter open. Not the casual cold of a storage bay or a maintenance corridor, or even a bad winter somewhere on a planet that has winters. This was a committed cold. A cold that had been cold for geological ages, and intended to remain so, and was simply informing you of this fact as clearly as it could. The suit took it without complaint. My face behind the visor did not feel it. My body did anyway, in the bone-deep way that certain extreme temperatures communicate themselves regardless of insulation, as a statement of fact about the environment rather than a physical sensation. Rook stepped out onto the surface first. He put his nose down immediately, taking in the composition of the air at ground level, which is different from the air a meter higher, and which tells a dog things that no instrument I carry can tell me. Storm hit him, and he didn't react to it. He had been in wind before. He stood for approximately 3 seconds, with his nose working, building whatever picture he was building, and then he oriented northeast, toward the signal, toward the direction I would have gone on my own. I've thought about that since. He oriented the same direction I would have navigated by instrument. I think the coincidence is less meaningful than it sounds. The distress signal was broadcast on an electromagnetic frequency, and there is reasonable evidence from later research that certain working dogs have a sensitivity to electromagnetic sources that human researchers have been arguing about for decades. Whether or not that was what he was following, the direction was right. I followed him into the wind. The surface was not what the sensor read out from inside the pod had suggested. The sensors showed an ice plain, which is accurate in the way that calling a battlefield a field is accurate. At ground level, what the sensors were averaging as a flat surface was a landscape of fractured plates and pressure ridges, some of them 2 and 3 meters high, separated by narrow channels of refrozen melt that were slick in ways the outer crust concealed. In the blue-green half-dark of the planet's bioluminescent upper atmosphere, all of it looked like the inside of something that had been broken. A lens, a mirror, something that had been whole once, moved through it with a confidence that had nothing performative in it. He wasn't moving fast. He was moving with the deliberateness of a dog that knows exactly what it's doing and sees no reason to do it in a way that calls attention to the knowing. I picked my way behind him. He went around the pressure ridges rather than over them. He chose the channels where the ice was oldest and most pressed rather than the newer ice that I would have read as solid. I could not have told you in the moment how I knew the difference between his choices and what I would have done. Only that several times I felt the pull of the tether redirect me away from a path I was already committing to. And each time I went where the tether pulled. We were at approximately 90 meters from the pod when he stopped. Not a slowing, not a cautious deceleration. Full stop, sudden. His weight dropping back onto his haunches in the specific way that means this is not hesitation and not uncertainty. This is information. His ears were up and rotating independently, which is the ear position that means he is pulling directional data from multiple sources simultaneously and has not yet resolved them into a single conclusion. I stopped behind him. I did not speak. The wind was doing what the wind does on a plane in the dark, on a planet that has no reason to accommodate human expectations, which is everything at once, and nothing that a human instrument can sort into useful signal. I could hear nothing over it that I could name. To approximately 12 meters in the direction of the storm and marginally farther downwind. The bioluminescent glow from the upper atmosphere made the ice surface look lit from within, which was beautiful in the way that things are beautiful, when they are also very dangerous. Held for 4 seconds. I counted them because that is the kind of counting you do when everything else has stopped. Then he turned 17 degrees left of our heading. I know the angle because I tracked it on the wrist unit's compass and started forward again at the same deliberate pace. And I followed him. The atmospheric particulate count on my suit's secondary display was climbing. I had been watching it for the past several minutes, and I could see now what I hadn't been able to see from inside the pod, the pattern of the increases. They came in long, slow pulses separated by pauses of irregular but bounded duration. They did not vary with the wind speed. They were consistent with something below the surface displacing ice as it moved. The way a large marine animal displaces water. The way a thing of enormous mass creates a pressure wave ahead of itself, simply by existing and moving. I had no framework for this at the time. I was building the framework in real time, from the evidence, which is the only way frameworks get built in a situation that has exceeded the existing ones. 17-degree deviation had taken us on a line that, on a map drawn afterward, would show a gentle arc away from the most direct northeast route and back toward it, curving around something roughly 40 meters in diameter that had been moving southwest at a pace measured not in meters per second, but in meters per minute. The deviation added perhaps 30 meters to our route. Without it, we would have been directly above the path of whatever was moving through the ice below us at the moment it passed. I did not know this at the time. I knew that Rook had changed our heading, and that I had followed the change, and that the particulate count had peaked and then begun to decline, which meant we had passed something, or something had passed us. At 160 meters from the pod, Rook stopped for the second time. This stop was different in its texture. First stop had been information gathering, ears working, assessment ongoing, conclusion pending. This stop was conclusion delivered. He came back 2 steps from his forward position, turned at an angle to our heading, and pressed his body against my legs, from the left side with his shoulder blade, with a weight and deliberateness that was entirely unlike casual contact. Working dogs have a lexicon of physical signals. This particular one, the shoulder contact stop, weight deliberately applied, no vocalization, was the signal I had learned to read as he has better information than I do, and I need him to stop moving. I stopped. I looked ahead. The surface of the ice 3 meters in front of where my next step would have landed began to move. It did not fracture. It did not heave upward in the dramatic way of geological events that happen quickly. It rose slowly, with the patience of a tide, a section perhaps 4 meters across lifting in a smooth, continuous motion. And as it rose, I saw what I had been looking at and misidentifying as ice for the entire time we had been outside. The surface in that area was not ice. It was a membrane, a biological membrane thin enough and cold enough that it had matched the surrounding ice in color and texture and thermal signature completely. It was the outer layer of something. The thing beneath it was moving. And as it moved, the membrane rose. And in the bioluminescent light coming down from the upper atmosphere, I could see through the thinning edges of the membrane to the mass below it. I will not describe what I saw in detail because I am not equipped to describe it accurately, and I am not interested in describing it inaccurately. I can say is this: it was large. Large. In the way of the largest things that humans build, which are large in a way that humans can still mentally encompass. Large in the way of geology. In the way of a process rather than a creature, so that the category of creature felt like the wrong frame even as my mind was reaching for it. The way a word sometimes doesn't fit the thing it was invented to name, and you feel the gap between them as a specific discomfort. I had a friend years ago who worked marine salvage on a water world, the kind of work that takes you deep enough that the pressure becomes a physical presence you're constantly negotiating with. He told me once that the worst part wasn't the depth, or the dark, or the danger of the equipment failing. The worst part, he said, was looking up through the water column and seeing something large pass between you and the surface, not because it was hostile, because it was big enough that you understood, viscerally and without the mediation of thought, that it was not including you in its calculations. You were in the water because you had put yourself there. It was in the water because the water was its medium, and always had been. Those two facts had no relationship to each other. That is the closest I can come to describing what I understood in those 37 seconds. It was moving in a direction that was not toward me. It was moving in a direction that was not away from me. It was moving in a direction that had nothing to do with me, and I understood. In that specific moment, with a clarity I have not been able to articulate fully since, that it had not noticed me. Not that it had noticed me, and was ignoring me. That I was not a factor in whatever constituted its awareness. The membrane rose and passed and settled. Particulate count on my display spiked to its highest reading, and then fell. I did not move. Rook did not move. SWOT registered the passage of a thermal anomaly. Something radiating heat at a level inconsistent with geological processes at this depth. Across a space 5 meters south of my position. The anomaly had a diameter, extrapolated from the passage time and the estimated velocity, of something over 40 meters. Passage took 37 seconds. When it was over, Rook turned northeast and walked forward. I want to be careful here about what I say and what I don't say. I am a mechanic. I have worked in extreme environments for most of my adult life, and I am not given to drama about them. The specific feeling I had standing on the surface of TL9 Bravo, while that thing moved under the ice force meets from where I was standing, was not the fear of a man who thinks he might die. I have thought I might die before, and the feeling is specific, and I know it well. What I felt was something else. The fear of scale, which is a different category. The recognition that what I was standing next to had not registered my existence, and would not register it regardless of what I did. Because I was not in the category of things that it registered. It was there before the concept of survival suits existed. It would be there after the concept of survival suits had been forgotten. I was in the way of something that did not have a concept of things being in the way. Rook had assessed this thing. He had navigated around the first instance of its presence. He had stopped me 3 meters from the edge of the membrane, and then, when the membrane had settled, he turned northeast and walked forward. Because the task was not to describe what had just happened, but to reach the distress signal, and the thing that had just passed was no longer between us and the distress signal. And so the relevant fact was direction. I followed him. This is what I mean when I say he navigated by the instrument inside him. Not the absence of fear. I don't know what a dog feels, and I won't pretend to. But the absence of hesitation after the assessment was complete. The thing had passed. The route was open. There was a job. He did the job. The remaining distance to the distress signal was approximately 70 meters. Covered it. In 11 minutes, which is slow. But the ice in that section was more heavily fractured, and Rook was picking the route with more care than on the outbound leg. And I understood later that the fracturing was not random geology, but a record of the things passing. The ice in the lanes it had used regularly was fractured and refrozen in characteristic patterns that a person trained in the right way could have read like tracks. Was reading them. He was routing around the lanes. Sierra Vance was lying in the shelter of a pressure ridge that had stopped her from sliding further into a subsurface channel running northeast to southwest. She was on her back, suit intact, visor clear. Her left arm was in a position that told me the brake was clean, and her suit had auto-splinted it. Her visor display showed a temperature reading that told me her suit heater was cycling at 30% capacity, which was enough to keep her alive, but not enough to keep her warm. And she had been out there long enough that the border between those two conditions was getting narrow. I had been building a picture of what we'd find during the last 70 meters. The signal had been consistent, no interruption, no change in strength, except the normal decay of increasing distance, converting to the increase of decreasing distance, which meant the transmitter hadn't been damaged and the person wearing it hadn't moved. Not moving in a survival situation either means you can't move or you've decided not to, and both of those possibilities have implications. I had prepared myself for something worse than what I found. What I found was a person who had made all the decisions available to her and was waiting for someone else to make the next one. She had activated the distress transmitter manually. I thought about that again, standing over her, with a broken arm and failing suit heat, and a planet with a flag on it, and no way to know if anyone would receive the signal or act on it. She had reached for the transmitter and pressed the button. The decision to send a signal that no one might receive is a specific kind of decision. It says, I'm going to do the thing that could matter, even if it doesn't. It says, I still believe it's worth trying. Is not a small leap to maintain in minus 47 degrees, with your heater at 30%. She had activated the distress transmitter manually. I thought about that, with a broken arm and a cold suit on a planet, with a flag on it in the outer system. She had reached for the transmitter and pressed the button. Rook reached her before I did. He got there, and he lay down beside her, which surprised me enough that I registered it as unusual, even in the moment. He is a working dog, trained, practical, focused on task. He is not trained in comfort response or patient support. He lay down along her right side and pressed his weight against her. And the suit registered the external heat input immediately. She told me later that she hadn't known what he was in the dark. She had heard something large arrive and had decided deliberately not to be afraid of it. She couldn't have done anything about it if she'd been afraid. So she had decided not to be. She is that kind of person. You the mechanic? She said when I crouched beside her. Dallin Marsh, your Vance? Sarah. I was in the secondary comms bay when we lost frame 14. She moved her right hand, tested it, noted that it worked. The left arm stayed still. She'd done her own inventory and knew what she had to work with. Can walk. We need to move carefully, I said. There's something out here that Rook is routing us around. When he changes direction, we change direction. Don't ask me to explain it right now. She looked at Rook. He had stood when I crouched and was facing the direction we'd come from, ears at the 45-degree angle. That is his active monitoring posture, neither alarmed nor disengaged. She looked at him for a moment, reading the posture, and then she looked at me. He's routing around what? I'll brief you on the Sojourner. She accepted this without argument. Comms officer learns early that information comes in sequence, and that demanding out-of-sequence information is a waste of the time you need for the information you can act on. She knew we needed to move. She focused on moving. She could walk. Not at the pace I would have set alone, but steadily, and without assistance beyond a hand on my arm for balance. Right hand on my left arm. Her left arm held immobile against her side, her breathing controlled and deliberate in the way of a person who has assessed a painful situation and decided to run it rather than resist it. Lead. I watched his ears, and it had hid the way I watch instrument panels, and I adjusted our course when he adjusted. He adjusted twice on the return leg. First time was a sharp directional change. Left, significant, cutting us away from a direct line toward the pod and threading us through a cluster of pressure ridges, rather than across the low ice shelf between them. I would have gone over the shelf. The ridges took us 4 minutes longer. I don't know what was under the shelf. The second adjustment was subtle. A drift of perhaps 10 degrees northward, gradual enough that if I hadn't been watching closely, I would have attributed it to the terrain rather than a choice. The drift took us around the outside of a section of ice that looked solid from above and wasn't. I know it wasn't because I kicked a loose shard that skidded across the surface and fell through into a subsurface void, and the sound it made falling told me the void was deep. Didn't look back when the shard fell through. He kept moving. He had made his assessment and communicated it through the lead, and we had followed it, and that was sufficient. The fact that I understood it only after the shard had confirmed it was a sequencing issue on my end, not on his. The pod came into visibility at approximately 40 meters, identified by the blinking locator light on its exterior that I had left running. I had not turned off the beacon. It was already lit when we landed, and turning it off would have required an active choice to break the rescue team's second instruction, and I had only broken the first one. The light was blinking at standard distress interval, steady and mechanical, and completely indifferent to everything that had happened around it, which is what locator beacons are for. 41 seconds. After we crossed back into the pod's immediate vicinity, the Sojourner's searchlights came through the cloud cover. I know the 41 seconds because I checked my watch. The rescue team was good. They came down fast, deployed through the main lock with a medical kit and a stretcher and the practiced efficiency of people who have done this enough times to have removed the performative elements from it. The team lead reached Sarah first, assessed the arm and the vertebrae in approximately 30 seconds, made 2 calls to the ship medic on his comm, and directed his team without raising his voice. She was on the stretcher in under 2 minutes. The secondary medic checked my ribs. 2 cracked, as I'd said. She taped them, gave me a counter-inflammatory from the kit, and told me to stay off heavy lifting for 3 weeks, in a tone that suggested she was aware of how that instruction would land with a ship's mechanic, and was saying it anyway for the record. Team lead saw Rook. He looked at him, the way people who have worked in the outer systems long enough look at working dogs, which is with a specific and unembellished respect, not the cooing over familiarity of someone encountering a dog as a novelty. Recognition of a professional identifying another professional. He crouched down briefly and offered his hand, and Rook sniffed it and accepted it, and the team lead stood back up and said nothing further about it, which was the correct response. We got into the transport. I sat in the bay, with Rook's head in my lap and a thermal blanket over both of us, and watched the planet drop away through the porthole. The bioluminescent glow of the upper atmosphere was visible from above as a green-blue shimmer that made the planet look, from this angle, almost gentle. It was not gentle. It had been doing what it did long before the survey team that generated the unresolved flag notation, and it was doing it still, and it would continue doing it with the geological patience of a thing that did not require anything to stop or start or acknowledge it. I looked at the shimmer for a long time as the Sojourner cleared Atmo, was breathing slow, and even with his weight in my lap. Then, we were in space and the planet was a point of reflected light like all the other points, and I stopped looking at it. The mission debrief on the Sojourner was thorough and handled by a woman named Orr, who had the patient, methodical intelligence of a good analyst, the kind who collects data before forming conclusions and forms conclusions before speaking. She took the sensor logs from the pod, the suit's secondary display data, showing the particulate count trajectory and the thermal anomaly readings, the exact heading deviations, the timing. She worked through it in sequence, without hurrying. She asked precise questions, and she listened to the full answer before writing. When she had the full sensor record, she set it aside and looked at me. "I want to understand the navigation," she said. "You've described the environmental data. I want to understand how you identified the creature's position and plotted a safe route in whiteout conditions." "Rook did it," I said. There was a pause. Not skepticism, not exactly. The specific pause of an analyst who has received information that is well-sourced and credibly delivered, and doesn't fit the framework she'd been assembling. "Dog," she said. "German Shepherd, 9 years old. His name is Rook." She looked at him. He was under my chair, lying on his side, his eyes half closed in the relaxed posture he takes when the work is done and the environment is safe. She studied him for a moment. He acknowledged her study with a brief ear movement and returned to his half-sleep. "Walk me through the specific behavioral signals you were using to navigate," she said. I walked her through it. Full stop with weight on haunches. The 17-degree heading change on the outbound leg. The shoulder contact stop at the membrane location. The 2 adjustments on the return. The ear positions, and what each indicated about his assessment state. I explained the short lead and the principle behind it. That the lead in low-visibility navigation is not a restraint but a data transfer line, translating his heading choices into physical information I could follow, without requiring him to vocalize or slow down. I explained the difference between his response to the thing beneath the ice and a standard working dog alarm response, and why the difference mattered. What he had done was navigation around a known hazard, not alarm at an unknown one. He had categorized it. He had charted around it. He had kept moving. She wrote through all of it without interrupting. When I finished, she reviewed her notes. "The standing protocol for a flagged location is shelter in place," she said. "That protocol exists because humans navigating unknown biological hazards in low visibility conditions have poor outcomes." "Yes," I said. "Vance would have died if you'd held protocol." "Yes," I said. "Her heater was at 30% when we reached her. The gap between alive and not was getting narrow." Orr looked at Rook again. He had shifted to lying on his belly now, chin on his paws, eyes closed. "Protocol doesn't account for a dog," she said. "No, it doesn't." She wrote one final note. Then she closed the file and thanked me for my time, and I took Rook and went to find the galley. I have thought about what Orr said in the weeks since. In the way you turn a small precise statement over in your mind when it has more inside it than the words themselves. She was right. The protocol doesn't account for a dog. It wasn't written with one in mind. It was written for a human surviving alone, in a survival suit on an ice planet with no additional resources, which is the scenario that produces the most predictable outcomes, and therefore the scenario that a protocol is written to address. A protocol written for the modal case is not equipped for the cases outside the mode, and that is not a flaw in the protocol. It is a structural property of all protocols, which are instruments for standardizing behavior in the cases that can be predicted. The cases that can't be predicted are, by definition, outside the protocol's scope. The thing about Rook is that he doesn't navigate by protocol. He navigates by the instrument inside him, the one that was being refined by selective pressure for thousands of years before any of the systems we use to model threats and route around them were invented. Threat detection capability is not a substitute for the instruments we carry. It is something different. It detects different things by different means, and with different reliability across different categories of hazard. The specific category of hazard, represented by TL9 Bravo, a massive subsurface organism moving through a fractured ice field in low visibility, radiating heat and displacing particulate matter in a pattern that no standard issue sensor was designed to detect. He was the correct instrument. He was also, of course, an elderly German shepherd who had been on a short tether in a blizzard for the better part of an hour and who, when we got back onto the Sojourner and the rescue medic, offered him a ration biscuit from her kit, ate it with the composed satisfaction of a professional, accepting a fee for a completed job. Sarah was out of medical in 11 days. The break was clean, and the vertebrae were compression fractures without neurological impact, which the surgeon described as lucky, and which I thought was an understatement. She came to find me in the equipment bay of the Sojourner, where I was back at a thruster manifold diagnostic, same work I'd been doing on the Archimedes, when frame 14 went. I don't think about that symmetry very hard. She sat on a parts crate and watched me work for a while, and Rook went and sat beside her without being invited, which he rarely does with people he doesn't know. And she put her good hand on his back. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Go ahead. When you came out of the pod, in the dark, with the thing out there, did you know you'd make it back?" I set down the diagnostic tool and thought about that for a moment. It deserved a real answer. "I knew Rook would navigate us out if it was navigable," I said. "That's not the same as knowing we'd make it back." But it was what I had. She thought about that. Outside the porthole behind her, the star field was the usual spread of points that didn't arrange themselves into anything meaningful from this angle. "That's enough," she said. "What he knows in the dark. That's enough to go on. He found you," I said. She didn't answer that. After a while, she took a small notebook from her breast pocket and a pen, and she asked me what he liked to eat. And I told her, and she wrote it down in the neat compact handwriting of someone who takes notes for a living and has learned that specificity is the difference between information and noise. I understood from the deliberateness of that action that she was recording a debt and intended to pay it in specific currency. That is the kind of person she is. That is the kind of person who presses the distress transmitter manually with a broken arm in the dark on a planet with a flag on it. She left the equipment bay after another 20 minutes, and I watched her go, and then I went back to the manifold. The Sojourner docked at Terminus Hub on the 17th. The debrief file went to the survey division. The sensor data from the pod and my suit went to a secondary office, whose full title I wasn't given, which I understood to be the office responsible for things that don't fit the existing classification systems. The shipping lane that ran through TL9 Bravo's system was rerouted within 48 hours of the file's receipt, which is faster than most bureaucratic processes move, and which tells me that the people who read the file understood what the data represented. The flag on TL9 Bravo was upgraded to active restricted. That means the system is off the transit tables now. It means no one will take a shortcut through it without an authorization that I understand is issued rarely and with extensive conditions. That seems right to me. Some places deserve to be left alone, not because there is nothing in them, but because what is in them is not waiting for us. I filed a maintenance transfer request for the next available rotation on Kappa Ring Station. Kappa Ring is quiet, well-maintained facilities, a good engineering team, regular resupply schedule. More importantly, it sits 1 light-year from a major hub, which puts rescue response times under 3 hours in any scenario I can model. I am aware that this preference is new. Before TL9 Bravo, I had not thought much about response times when selecting rotation assignments. I think about them now. There is no shame in that. Was asleep in the bunk beside mine before the Sojourner had cleared the dock. He runs in his sleep sometimes. The legs his move in long, even strides, the methodical rhythm of a dog following a track. And I watch him and think about what track it might be. I don't know. I don't have access to what he dreams about, and I've stopped needing to. He found the track when there was a track to find. That's enough. In the weeks since, I have filed a formal recommendation to the Survey Division's Protocol Office. I asked them to add a notation to the standing shelter-in-place guidelines for flagged locations. The notation I proposed reads something like this: in conditions where standard sensor equipment cannot adequately characterize the environmental hazard, handler discretion exception applies when a trained working animal indicates a navigable route by means including but not limited to directional deviation, sustained physical contact indicating obstacle avoidance, and sustained alerting posture. The exception is at handler discretion, and handler is solely responsible for outcome. They sent back a form asking me to clarify what I meant by indicates. I thought about that for a long time. I thought about the shoulder contact in the dark, the weight on the haunches. The 17-degree deviation that I felt through the lead as a direction rather than a restriction. The ear positions at 45 degrees, and then at full vertical, and then settling back. None of these translate cleanly into the formal language that protocols require. Eventually I wrote, sustained directional pressure via lead in low visibility conditions. Abrupt stationary behavior with weight distributed to hind quarters. Petative independent heading behavior. Overriding commanded heading. The handler will recognize the signals in context. Don't know if they'll add the notation. I don't know if it will matter to the next mechanic. Stranded on the next ice planet with the next working dog. Protocols are written for the modal case, and this is an edge case, and edge cases tend to stay edges. But I put it in writing. I put it somewhere it could be found by someone who needed it. That seemed like the right thing to do with what I'd learned. The evening before we docked at Kappa Ring, I was in the equipment bay running a routine check. the kind of familiar procedure that doesn't require much conscious attention. And Rook was lying in his spot against the wall, and I was thinking about the membrane on the surface of TL9 Bravo, the way it rose slowly with the patience of a tide, and about the thing underneath it that had passed without noticing us. I thought about how old it must be. Not in the way you think about something impressive being old. In the way you think about something that predates the existence of any category you would use to evaluate it. And I thought about what Orr said. The protocol doesn't account for a dog. No, it doesn't. It doesn't account for 9 years of working a freight circuit in the outer belt with a specific animal who has been learning, continuously and in parallel, what I don't know how to detect. It doesn't account for the accumulated specific intelligence of a creature whose ancestors were navigating exactly this kind of problem. Hazard detection, threat routing, alive or not assessment. In a time when the only tool available was the instrument inside them, it accounts for a human alone, which is the most common case. It cannot account for the uncommon case, because that's what uncommon means. We docked at Kappa Ring on the 3rd, put me on the primary maintenance rotation the same week. Good team. Quiet station. The first morning I walked the maintenance corridors with Rook at my left side and checked the manifolds and the pressure seals and the sensor arrays, and he moved through Thief Station the way he always moves. Deliberate, professional. Checking everything I don't check without being asked to. Noting the things I'll never have access to and acting on them so quietly that I only understand what he's done when the evidence arrives later. There's a gray patch developing behind his left ear. It wasn't there last year. 9 years is well into the back half for a working dog, and I hold that arithmetic without examining it too closely. I keep him in work because working animals deteriorate without work, and because I need him in work, and because honesty requires me to say both of those things, rather than only the one that sounds more dignified. He hits the deviations before I know there's something to deviate from. He still stops with his weight on his haunches when the data I can't read tells him to stop. Time you know is the time you're safe. My father said that. It's not her tight logic, but I check my watch. I know what time it is. And Rook is already ahead of me, out on the ice, navigating by the instrument inside him, waiting without impatience for me to catch up. That's what he does. It's enough.